B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn sukkah Daf Chof Aleph, and we're going to start at the bottom of Daf Chof Amud Beis, the new Mishnah, a new Perek. Says the Mishnah, Hayashon tachas hamita b'sukkah. If somebody sleeps underneath a bed in the sukkah, and we know that the main dwelling that one has to do in a sukkah, Rashi says here, is eating, sleeping, and eating, drinking, and sleeping. On Daf Chof Ches, we'll see some more things that should be done in a sukkah. But sleeping has to be done inside the sukkah. We assume that inside the sukkah means under the schach. And this person, instead of sleeping on top of the bed under the schach, he's sleeping under the bed. Says the Tana Kama, Lo yotzi deichei vasoi, he's not been yotza, because there's something called an oyhel. An oyhel means a tent. It means a halachically defined roofing is separating between the schach and himself. So for all intents and purposes, he's not under the schach, he's under a different oyhel. He's under the bed. The bed itself is not kosher schach. He's not been yotza. Omer Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda argued and says, we used to sleep under the bed. And the elders saw that. They didn't stop us. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda maintains that even under the bed, it's okay to one has been yotza the mitzvah of sukkah. And obviously, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the bed in and of itself is not an issue, is not a separation between the schach and the person underneath it. That means the bed does not have the status of oyhel, and if it does have a status of oyhel, relative to the status of oyhel of sukkah, it's insignificant. And we're going to see that in the Gemara. Omer Reb Shimon narrated that Maisa b'tovi avdoi, Shara ben Gamliel, that Rabbi Gamliel had a slave called Tovi, and he used to sleep under the bed in the sukkah. Rabbi Gamliel said to the elders, Tovi Avdi, did you see my slave Tovi? He's a very wise person, very knowledgeable. And he knows he knows that slaves are exempt of the mitzvah of sukkah, because the slaves are required with the same mitzvahs as women are, and women are not required with the mitzvah of sukkah because it's a mitzvah saseisha azman groma, it's a time restricted mitzvah. Lefikach yoshon utachas hamita, and that's why he would sleep under the sukkah. And Reb Shimon said, Ulefi darkeinu, and to be congruent with our ways, that when we would hear Talmidei Chachomim saying things, even just casually, even if they were not intending to teach us anything, we would think very carefully and understand what can we learn. What divrei Torah can we learn from the words of the Chachomim? There's no idle chatter from Chachomim. So Reb Shimon said, when we listened to Rabbi Gamliel, even though Rabbi Gamliel was just saying over casually to the Chachomim, who was talking about his slave, the wisdom of his slave, Lamadnu, we learned we learned from him that somebody who sleeps under the sukkah has not done the mitzvah of sukkah, has not fulfilled his requirement, and that is congruent with the Tana Kama here, who say that Hayoshon tachas hamita b'sukkah lo yotzi deichei vasei. Says the Gemara, v'holeka asara. We know that an oyhel is always 10 tefachim. This bed is not usually 10 tefachim off the ground. If so, since the airspace between the bed and the floor is less than 10 tefachim, the bed would not be considered an oyhel, and if it's not considered an oyhel, it would not be an interruption between the person underneath it and the schach. Why then do the Chachomim say he was not yotza? Answers the Gemara, and we saw this on Daf Yomi Shiur base. Tirkama Shmuel interprets this b'mita asara, that when the Mishnah says that if you sleep under a bed, the Tana Kama says you're not yotza, it's only if the height of the bed is off the floor 10 tefachim, it has the status of an oyhel, and now you're under an oyhel called bed, and not under a covering called sukkah, and you're not yotza. Continues the Gemara, and now we're moving over to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said there's no issue with sleeping under the bed. Let's discuss that. And the Gemara starts with a Mishnah in Masechet sukkah. Tanan, we learned in Alois, Tanan Hossam. Echod, and over there we're talking about the concept of oyhel, not in Hilchas Sukkah, but in Hilchas Tumah. And we've learned that if a kazayas of a corpse, of a dead person, is found under the same roofing as other utensils and other items and people, anything that is under the same roof as a dead corpse, or even part of a corpse, a kazayas min hames, the roofing transmits tumah to everything underneath the roof. and it's choitzet. It separates from the tumah from penetrating and going up. So something on top of the roof would not become tummy. But for that, it needs to have the status of oihel. And for that, we have a Masechet Oholos. So there in Perek Gimel Mishnah Zayin, the Mishnah says as follows: Echod choyer, if you have a hollow in a stone, shechoreruhu mayim, that is the water hollowed out. Oishrotzim, or some creeping creatures hollowed out an area, and a typical oihel has to be a tefach by a tefach by a tefach, a square tefach, the height of a tefach. So if either the water or some creatures hollowed out a stone, oisha ochlosoi melchas, or if some minerals ate away at the rock, and now there's a cavity there, there's a hole there. V'chein madvach avonim, or a pile of stones. When somebody innocently piled up some stones, and it's very common that between the stones, at some point, the stones are not exactly on top of each other. There's a gap of a tefach by tefach by tefach in between the stones. V'chein soyer shel koiros, a stack of beams. Also, when beams are stacked up, it could very well be that there's a hole there of a cubic tefach. Then ma'il ala tumah. The Tanakama says that all these areas, providing they're a cubic tefach, they are considered oihel, and if within this space you've got also a kazayis min hames, and also something toher, then that toher item is going to become tomei. Rabbi Yehuda argues and says, no, the common denominator between all these things is kol oihel she'enoi osoi b'dei adam enoi oihel. In order for something to have a halachically defined and status of oihel, it must be that not only the person made it, it must be the person intended it to be, so that the covering should be as an oihel, as a covering for the area underneath it. So in the case of the water, the creatures and the minerals, the person didn't even make it. In the case of the stones and the beams, the person did pile up the stones and the beams, but he did not intend that gap to be as an oihel, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda says, "Ein oihel," it's not considered an oihel, and in the halachas of Tumah. My Talmud Rabbi Yehuda, what would be the source of Rabbi Yehuda? So he learns out, Yalif oihel mimishkan. We learned about this in Masechet Shabbos, that you learn oihel of Tumah from oihel by, and oil by poraduma, from oihel to the Mishkan. The ksiv hocha, it says in one pasuk, Zois haTorah Odom kiyomus ba'oihel, kol ha'bo'el o'oihel v'chol ha'sheba'oihel yitmo shivas yomim. Uchsiv Hosam, and in another parasha by the Mishkan it says, Vayifrois es ha'oihel ala Mishkan vayosem es michsas ha'oihel olav milamalo kashetziva Hashem es Moshe. Twice it says oihel, once regarding Tumah and once regarding the Mishkan. Ma'al ha'alon, in the same way as by the Mishkan, the coverings by the Mishkan, b'dei Adam, were positioned there by man and with the intentions of making an oihel. Afkan, so too, Tumah will only be transmitted b'dei Adam if the oihel was made b'dei Adam. Asks the Gemara v'Rabbanon, the Tanakam of that Mishnah who say that even an oihel that's not made b'dei Adam is also ma'il ala Tumah. Answers the Gemara, oihel, riba. In the parasha of Paraduma, it mentions oihel many times in order to impress on us that any type of oihel, even an oihel that's not made b'dei Adam, is considered an oihel. Says the Gemara, or asks the Gemara, V'sova Rabbi Yehuda, can it possibly be that Rabbi Yehuda holds, as he says explicitly in that Mishnah in Arlois, Kol oil she'enoi also b'dei Adam einoi oihel, that an oil that was not made by man is not considered an oihel, or a minhu? We're going to ask a contradiction from this, from a Mishnah in Masechet Parah Perek Gimel. What does it say in Masechet Parah? Chatzeiros hoyu bnuyos b'Yerushalayim. They would build courtyards in Yerushalayim, al gabe hasela, on a rock foundation, v'tachtehem chalal, and underneath these courtyards there would be an empty space of a tefach, in mipnei kever hatahoim, just in case in the depths there was a corpse buried that we don't know about, and we know the halacha is that if a corpse is buried and you haven't got a tefach above it, then the tumah penetrates up all the way to the sky and down to the depths. In order to avoid this, they would build these courtyards on stilts of a tefach, and therefore, even if there was tumah deep down, it would not penetrate, it would not reach the people on top of on the courtyards, in these chatzeros. Umavim noshim ubrois, they would bring pregnant women to these courtyards. V'yoildeis sham, they would give birth in these courtyards. Umegadleis b'neim sham, they would bring up their children there. And the reason they did this was lepara, in order that the children that were going to be engaged in drawing the water that's going to be used to be mixed with the ashes of Parah Aduma should never have even remotely come in contact with even a suffix of Tumas Meis. Because Kever HaTohim is another term used for suffix. We don't know if there's anything buried deep down. So any suffix Tumah is called Kever HaTohim. These courtyards that were built on these stilts of a tefach, then anyone who was there, anyone who was born there, would never have even remotely been able to become Tomei Tumas Meis. And elsewhere in Shas, the Gemara explains why the Chachamim were so stringent here. And Umevim Shvorim, they would bring oxen, V'al Gabeim, and on the oxen there would be dalsois, there would be doors, that would be flat on top of the backs of these oxen. V'tinoikis, and these young children who were young enough to have ever been able to become Tomei themselves. And the Tinoikos Yeshin al Gabeim would sit on the backs of these oxen, on top of the doors. The Koisos Shel Evan, and they would have these jugs, these cups made of earthenware, of stone, Biyodem in their hands, also a type of material that cannot become easily Tomei. And Higiu, and then they would go L'Shiloach, all the way to the Shiloach stream. Yerdu, then the children would go off these oxen down L'Toich HaMayim, into the water. Umil and would fill up these Koisos. V'olu, v'yashvulem, then they would go back on and would come back to bring the water back to where the Kohanim would then use it to prepare the Parah Aduma. Rabbi Yossi says, the children would not even go down from the oxen, rather they would lower, on a string, they would lower these utensils from where they were on top of the doors into the water, and fill them up, because again, if you go off the oxen, maybe you'll be on top of an area where there is some tumah deep down buried, some tumas meis, and which doesn't have a tefach, and the tumah penetrates up and will make the child tomei. And therefore, in order to stay far, far away from even the remotest chance of becoming tomei, Rabbi Yossi says that the children would actually stay on top of these oxen and the doors on top of the oxen. So that's what we saw in a Mishnah in Masechet Parah. V'tanya, and we learned in a Brisa, in Tosefta in Masechet Parah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Lo hayu meviim dalsois ela shvarim. Rabbi Yehuda says they wouldn't bring the doors, they would only bring the oxen, they would sit on top of the oxen. Asks the Gemara, V'hashvarim, these oxen, why would they sit on top of the oxen? Let's assume it's because if they're sitting on top of the oxen, then even if there's going to be any tumas hatahoim underneath the ox, because there's a tefach gap between the bottom of the stomach, the belly of the ox, and the ground, that will split up. That will be a separation between the tumah and the child on top of the ox, and it will serve the ox itself will be an oihel. The Gemara says, you Rabbi Yehuda say, don't bring doors, just bring the oxen. But these oxen themselves, they are doors, they are an oihel that were not made by man. Nobody, when these oxen were created, they were not created in order to serve as a covering for something underneath them. And Rabbi Yehuda says that kol oihel she'eino osu b'dei adam eino oihel. So the Mishnah in Arloi says that Rabbi Yehuda says that an oil not made by man with the intentions of being used for an oil is not considered an oil. Here we have a Tosefta on the Mishnah in Masechet Parah that tells us that according to Rabbi Yehuda, then the using the area underneath the ox suffices. There seems to be a contradiction. If you were to use doors, we can understand the doors were placed by people in order to serve as an oil. But if the Rabbi Yehuda says in the Tosefta here, you don't use doors, you just use the oxen themselves. That's an oil she'eino nasa b'dei adam. Uktani Rabbi Yehuda Omer lo hayu meviim dalsois ela shvarim. Rabbi Yehuda says they wouldn't use the doors, only the oxen. How do we explain this contradiction? Ki aser Rav Dimi Omer Rabbi Elazar. Rav Dimi said in the name of Rabbi Elazar that moida Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, when do we learn out from Mishkan that an oihel has to be made by man? That's only when it's exactly a tefach cubed. A tefach cubed is a weaker type of oihel. It has to be made with the intentions of being done as an oihel, and we learn that out from Mishkan. However, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that when the oihel is a cubic meloi egroif, which is larger than a tefach, it's the fist of somebody called ben avtiach, which is the size of the head of a person. There's a question whether it's the head of a child or the head of an average person, but the head, it's called a meloi egroif, a fist of this person called ben avtiach. And if a type of area, an oihel, which is a cubic meloi egroif, in that case, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that even if it's not made b'dei Adam, it can serve as an oihel. And Tani Nami Hochi, we actually learned a brisa to this effect. And if you look in the Mishnah in Alois, it's actually explicit in the Mishnah in Alois that we learned that Moed Rabbi Yehuda agrees that when do we say that Kol Oihel She'einu Osu B'dei Adam Einu Oihel, only if it's a cubic tefach. But Rabbi Yehuda says if it's a cubic meloi egroif, then it is called an oihel, and therefore b'shkifin, these uprooted boulders, when you've got these big boulders that have gone uprooted from a mountainside, and now in the mountainside you have a gap, an oihel, which is larger than a meloi egroif, or b'nekike sloim, or the cracks in the rocks, these cracks are larger than a cubic egroif. In that case, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that we would not learn out from Mishkan that it has to be Osu B'dei Adam. We have other sources to learn that it would be considered an oihel even if it's not Osu B'dei Adam. That means, since there's other sources that say that an oihel does not have to be made b'dei Adam, the oihel from Mishkan is only referring to the smallest size oihel, which is a cubic tefach. Only there it has to be made b'dei Adam. Asks the Gemara, is that true? Is that how you're understanding Rabbi Yehuda? That the reason that you can use the bellies of the oxen as an oihel is because it's more than a cubic meloi egroif. V'haloi deles, the doors themselves, had you put them on the oxen, the yeshbo kama egroif, in there it's a cubic, more than a cubic egroif, it's more than a few egroifs size. On the width of the door, the height between the door and the floor, there's plenty there. Uktani Rabbi Yehuda says that don't bring doors, which means that for some reason the meloi egroif doesn't even help here, even for doors, even though the doors were made by man. For some reason, Rabbi Yehuda says this is not called an oihel. If the doors are not called an oihel, then of course the oxen themselves would not be called an oihel. So how can you say the oxen are called an oihel because of meloi egroif? Well, then why does Rabbi Yehuda say don't use the doors? That's how Rashi seems to understand this Gemara, but many Rishonim have an issue understanding this question of the Gemara. But either way, Omar Abaya answers, I'll tell you what Rabbi Yehuda meant. So of course Rabbi Yehuda agrees that you could have put doors on top of the oxen, and of course the doors are wide enough and big enough, and the doors were actually made by man. Of course the doors would be okay. Rabbi Yehuda just says you don't need the doors because the oxen themselves are enough, because you have a cubic egroif underneath. You have enough space, the width of the oxen, and the height between the oxen and the ground is more than an egroif, and therefore it's considered an oihel, and that's why it's okay. That's how Abaya explained Rabbi Yehuda. Rava Omar, Loi hoyu meviim dalsis kol ikar. Rava says that the reason they wouldn't bring the doors is not because we have an issue that it's not considered an oihel. Of course it's considered an oihel. Nonetheless, don't bring the doors. Why? Because the doors are actually going to be a disadvantage to us. Because why do you have the doors there? Just to make sure that the child should sit squarely on top of the oihel and not lean over. Because as soon as he leans over outside, beyond the oihel, then again we have an issue with kever hatohim. In the event that there's a corpse buried deep down, the tumah will penetrate up and the child will become tomei. And if you just have the oxen, the child will be nervous to move. He'll make sure to stay in the middle of the ox, not to fall off. As soon as you put a platform there, you put a door there, he's going to feel comfortable. He's going to start peeking over the edge. As soon as he starts leaning over the edge, we've lost the effect of bringing the child in this way. Says Rava Omar lohoyu mevi'in dalsis kol ikar mipnei shedaita shel tinei gas alov. The child's mind will be at ease. And then Shema Yotzi Roisha, he's going to, maybe his head, or Echod Meivarov, or any of his other limbs, he's going to take out, he's going to protrude beyond the oihel, v'yitzman become tomei b'kever tahim, with this sofik tumah. Tanu Kavasei de Rava, and we actually found a brisa that says, like Rava says, that Rabbi Yehuda Omer loy hoyu meviin daltzis kol ikar. Rabbi Yehuda says they would not put doors on top of the oxen. Why? Mipnei shedaita shel tinei gasa olav shama yotzi roishoi oyechod meivarav yitma bekever hatohim. Elo says Rabbi Yehuda meviim shvarim. They would bring shvarim amitzrim, the wide oxen from Egypt, shekreisoi sehen rechovois, whose bellies, whose stomachs are very wide. Vatinoikas yeshun al gabeim, and the children would sit on top of it. Bekoisis sheleven biyadeim, and they would have the earthenware cups in their hands. Higia l'shiloach, and when they would reach the Shiloach stream, Yerudu, they would go down. The Buddha holds like the Tanakama in the Mishnah in Paro, that they would actually go off the oxen once they're in the water. Umilum, and they would fill up the cups with water. Va'olu, and they would go back up onto the oxen, v'yeshulem al gabem, and sit on top of the oxen, and they would go back and bring the water back to where the Kohanim were waiting for it. So this is so far what we've learned about Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says that a tefach by tefach, a cubic tefach is only considered an oihel if it's made by man, and man intended it to be used as an oihel. And if it's a cubic egroif, then even if it was not made by man, it's considered an oihel. And now we're coming back to our Mishnah. Vare mita, back to the bed. The yeshbo kama egroifim. There's at least a cubic egroif of the width of the bed, the height between the bottom of the bed and the floor. Nonetheless, we saw in the Mishnah, we used to, in front of the elders, we would lie under the beds in the sukkah, and we would sleep there. How can you do that? The bed is definitely considered an oihel. Had we not learnt this Gemara, we would have said that maybe the oihel was not made to serve the area underneath it. No one puts a bed there in order to serve as an oil for the area underneath. So it's considered oil which is not also b'de adam, similar to the midvach avonim, to the pile of stones or to the stack of beams. And then we would say that it's not called an oihel. But once you say that if it's kamaloi egra, if it's called an oihel, we have an issue here. How could Rabbi Yehuda sleep under the sukkah? Answers the Gemara, Shani mita hoyel ulegabo asuya. Here it's worse. It's not just that this wasn't made for the area underneath. Here it was actually made to serve exclusively the area on top of the bed. Since it was made exclusively to serve the area on top of the bed, and almost to say to the exclusion of the area underneath it, even though it's a malay egroif, it's not considered an oihel. Asks the Gemara, Shvarim namni, let's go back to the oxen. Legabon asuin. These oxen, they're made, so to what were oxen made for? To carry people on top of the ox, not to serve as a roofing for the area underneath the ox. And nonetheless, we said before, by the Mishnah in Parah, that they would use the ox as an oihel from the Tumas HaTohaim. Ki also Ravin Omer Belazar, Ravin said in the name of Rabbi Lazar, oxen are different. Shani shvorim hoyelu maginim al haroyim b'chama b'pnei achama b'gshomim b'pnei agshomim. They were used to using the backs of the oxen also as an oil for the area underneath it, because the shepherds in the summer, they would put their heads underneath the bellies of the oxen in order to be in the shade, and in the rain they would be underneath the oxen in order not to get wet. So you see that the backs of the oxen were used not only to serve what's being done on top of the ox, but also to serve what's underneath the ox. Ihocha, says the Gemara, mitonami, a bed also, it's true that primarily beds are there to be slept on, not under, but the beds also are used sometimes to protect those things underneath it. They protect the shoes and the sandals. And why exactly shoes and sandals are chosen is something that Rashi discusses here. But the shoes and sandals were typically kept underneath the bed. So you see a bed is serving even the area underneath it. And then the question comes back. So it is considered an oihel. If it's considered an oihel, how could you be able to sleep underneath it? Ela Omar, Rava explained Shani Shvarim, the difference between beds and oxen is that Hoyel va'asuyin lahogin al bnei me'ayim shelahem. Rava said it's not because of what was done under the ox. That alone wouldn't suffice. But the back of the ox itself was created with the intentions of protecting everything that's inside the belly of the ox. All the intestines of the ox are being protected by the top of the back of the ox, by the spine and everything around it on top of the intestines. And therefore it's considered an ohel, not because of something you would do underneath the ox. And therefore the ox is called an ohel. A bed is not considered an ohel. Shenema, where do we see that the purpose of the skeleton of an ox would be used to serve to protect the intestines inside the ox? Because we find in a similar context, as it happens, it's a pasuk in Eiv talking about man, but the same applies to an ox. That it says in the pasuk, "Oiru boso talbisheni," you have clothed me with skin and flesh, ubatzomis v'gidin, and with bones and sinews, tesoichacheni, you have sheltered me. So you see that the bones and the sinews of a person, and the same would apply with oxen, are used as a schach to cover over the intestines, and therefore the back of an ox is considered an ohel according to Rabbi Yehuda. A bed, however, that's made primarily, is not made in order to sleep under, it's not considered an ohel. That would be one way of explaining the Mishnah. Another explanation of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, is Rabbi Yehuda letamei, because Rabbi Yehuda himself holds the Omar sukkah diras keva be'inon. There's a nature of fixture that's attributed to a sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda actually says that in certain areas the sukkah must have a permanent nature. And we discussed this already on Daf Zayin. V'havelei mito diras arai. The bed itself is considered a diras arai. It's temporary, certainly relative to sukkah, that has to be fixed. Rashi in Daf Yud Aleph says that a bed is arai because it moves, it's not fixed. But either way, over here, the Gemara is saying that the bed is not there's no din, the bed has to be fixed, the sukkah has to be fixed. According to Rabbi Yehuda, v'sukkah oyel keva, v'lei osi oyel arai u'mevatel oyel kvar. In this explanation, a bed is called an oyel. Not like the first explanation, a bed's not called an oyel. No, we say a bed is called an oyel. However, since relative to sukkah, it's called a temporary type of oil versus the sukkah, which is a permanent one. The temporary sukkah, the temporary oil, the temporary nature of oil of the bed is not enough to undermine the permanent nature of oil of the sukkah. And since you with the bed are in the sukkah, it's considered that you're under the roofing of the sukkah, and it's not considered as if the roof, the temporary roofing of the bed, is in separating between you and the sukkah, and therefore it's kosher. Asks the Gemara, V'harab Shimon de Omar Nami sukkah diras keva be'inon. We already saw in Daf Zayin that Reb Shimon, like Rabbi Yehuda, holds that a sukkah has to have a permanent nature on some level. We saw over there, Reb Shimon says you need 4 walls to the sukkah, not like the Chachomim who say just 3. V'osi oyel arai u'mevatel oyel kva. And why don't we? And according to Reb Shimon, it's very clear that the bed, that if you sleep underneath the bed, you're not yotze the mitzvah of sukkah. Why not? Why don't you say that the oil arai is not mevatel the oil kva? It was Reb Shimon in the Mishnah that said over from Rabbi Gamliel that sleeping under the bed, you're not yotze the mitzvah of sukkah. Reb Shimon understood that from the casual talk of Rabbi Gamliel. Why would that be true? Reb Shimon says sukkah is oil kva, the bed is an oil arai, loy osi oil arai, mevatel oil kvar. Answers the Gemara that b'hokam pligi, that's exactly what Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Shimon are arguing about. Mar sovar osi oil arai u'mevatel oil kvar. Reb Shimon holds that a temporary type of oil can actually undermine a permanent type of oil and is mevatel it. Or Mar sovar, however, Rabbi Yehuda holds no, loy osi oil arai mevatel oil kvar. Rabbi Yehuda holds a temporary oil will not be mevatel a permanent one. Continues the Gemara, Omer Reb Shimon, Maise b'tovi avdoi, the end of the Mishnah. Reb Shimon narrated a story with Rabbi Gamliel, who was casually discussing the virtues and the wisdom of his slave Tovi. Tani, we learned in the Brisa, Omer Reb Shimon, Misichoisav Sherabin Gamliel. It doesn't say Midvar of Sherabin Gamliel. It says Misichoisav. From the casual conversation of Rabbi Gamliel, Lomadnu Shnei Dvarim, we learned 2 things. Lomadnu she'avodim p'turim in sukkah. We learned that slaves are exempt from sukkah. V'lamadnu she'ayoshon tachas sukkah lo yotzoi deichei v'osei. We also learned that sleeping under the sukkah, you're not yotze the mitzvah of sukkah, because that was the wisdom of this slave, that he understood he was potter, and therefore he went under the sukkah. Asks the Gemara. That was the Brisa. The Gemara is asking, V'leima why don't you say the midvor of Reb Shimon, from the words of Reb Shimon? Why do you say misichoisov of Reb Shimon? Answers the Gemara, milse agav urche kamashmalon, because this is something which was learnt by the way. Ki hada omer of Acha bar Ada, v'omer lo omer of Acha bar Ada omer Rav Hamnuna, omer Rav, minayin she'afilu sichas talmidei chachomim tzricha limud, shene'emar v'oleu lo yiboil. How do we know that even the casual conversation of Talmidei Chachomim, it's worth focusing and concentrating to see what you can learn from it? It says in the Pasuk, V'oleu, even the seemingly more trivial parts of the plant, which is the leaves, lo yiboil, will not wither. There's something to be gained from it. So too Talmidei Chachomim, everything they say, even if it's not with the intentions of teaching something, if you focus on what they're saying, and you can actually learn something from it. And that's what Reb Shimon was saying. Misichoisov Shel Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel was not coming to teach us something. He was just telling the elders about the wisdom of his slave. But we were accustomed, that's as it says in the Mishnah, Lefi Darkeinu, we were accustomed to trying to understand what can be learned even from the casual conversation of Talmidei Chachomim. And when we heard Reb Shimon when we heard Reb Gamliel casually telling the Zkenim, the elders, about his slave, we said, what halachas can we learn here? We learned two halachas. We learned that slaves are potter from sukkah, and we learned that sleeping under the sukkah is potter. Continues the next Mishnah. Hasoymech sukkosei bekari amito. If somebody rests his schach on the posts of a bed, you have a whole bed adjacent to a sukkah, and on one of the posts, which is obviously at least 10 tvachim high, you actually rest the schach on the bedposts. Kshera, the Tanakhama say it's kosher. Why not? Beds can be made of anything. The walls can be made of anything, and as long as the schach is kosher, it's fine. Rabbi Yehuda says no. If were you to move the bed away, the schach would fall down. Psula, it's possible. A schach that's supported by a bed is possible. We don't know why, we'll see in the Gemara. Says the Gemara, my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. What would be the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? Why should this sukkah be possible? Says the Gemara, Pligi bar Abzeir Rav Abba bar Mamel. So Machleikas Chad Omar, one of these two Chachomim explained, Mipnei she'ein lo keva. We saw before, Rabbi Yehuda holds, a sukkah has to have an element of permanence to it. Since this bed, we already seen, a bed is not permanent, so the schach that is resting and being supported by something which is arai, which is very temporary, which is just moved around, it's not keva, it's not fixed. If it's not fixed, it's a postel sukkah according to Rabbi Yehuda. V'chad Omar. The other explanation is since a bed itself is a davar makabel tumah, especially when it's a whole bed, it's makabel tumah, and we know that to use something which is roy lekabel tumah as schach is certainly possible. Over here, since it's being entirely supported by something which is roy lekabel tumah, there's too much influence of something which is roy lekabel tumah on the schach, and therefore the Rabbi Yehuda says you cannot use it, you cannot support your schach with davar makabel tumah. My benai, what would be the difference between these two explanations? If you took rods of metal and you stuck them into the ground and you put the schach on top of them, you supported the schach on top of them. If the explanation that says that the reason Rabbi Yehuda says that schach resting on the beds is no good is because it's not permanent. Hariyesh lo keva, over here it's permanent, it's stuck into the ground. But the opinion who says that the reason it was possible was because it's being supported by a davar makabel tumah. He's supporting over here. He's supporting a schach on these rods. These rods of metal are davar makabel tumah, and therefore it will be possible. Omar Abaya. Lo yishonu, this whole machleikus here, whether if you support the schach on the end of a bed, it's kosher or not, is only elos somach, is when you're actually supporting the schach on the ends of the bed. Aval sikech al gav hamita, but if you put the schach, which is properly supported, a regular kosher schach, that's supported in the way it's supposed to be, that will not be an issue. Not for arai, and not for davar makabel tumah, kosher schach, and it happens to be that you're using beds as your walls, but they're not supporting the schach, and you just put the schach al gav hamita. In that case, kshera, it's kosher even according to Rabbi Yehuda. My tama, why would this be true? The opinion to explain the reason that when you support the schach on the end of the bed, it's possible is because it's not permanent enough. Harayesh lo keva. Over here we're talking about that the schach was permanently fixed. It's just that the walls were 3 beds that were surrounding the sukkah, and they were used as the walls, but the schach is permanent. The opinion that says that the reason it was possible is because it's being supported by a davar makabel tuma. Over here, the schach is not being supported by something which is roi lekabel tuma, and just because the walls are roi lekabel tuma, we never had an issue with walls. We only had an issue with schach and something which is supporting the schach. And in the next shiur, we're going to learn the next Mishnah.